It was 40 years ago, I know 40 years ago, a long time ago, that I started to work at Grumman right after I finished college. And when I first started to work there, you know, you're the new guy on the block, you're trying to figure things out. And some of the regulars that had been there for some time had invited me to start eating lunch with them. So I said, well, this is a great idea. I'll go and eat lunch with them, you know, and I'll get to know them a little better, maybe figure out the operations around here, what's important, what's not important. We'll all get to know each other. That's a good thing. So, you know, those first couple of weeks went by, and I noticed that a regular theme in the conversation there was basically talking about this one guy who worked there who must have been the most terrible person on the face of the earth. I hadn't met him, so I didn't know him at all. But the things that they would say about him sometimes, or the way they would talk about him sometimes, really started building up this image in my head of this really terrible and horrible person. And I just listened to it, and I never really chimed in because I didn't know the person, but I just kind of was wondering about this person until that day came when I was asked to make a delivery to his office. And I had to go and bring him this package, and I was like, oh boy, I don't know what to expect. So I get the package, and I go, and I hand it to him, and he looks at me and he goes, oh, thank you. I was like, aren't you supposed to be some big bad ogre that was about to pounce on me and yell at me just because I showed up at your door or something? It wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't the individual at all that I felt that they were talking about. It was like two different people. And as I did get to know him a little bit more, I started to find out he's just an average guy. He's another person that happened to be working in the same company that I did and was a fairly decent person. So I don't know where all of that came from. But I will say this, there are times when we are, in effect, made blind by others. You know, there's this strange thing that goes on. This was back in the 80s, back before they had things like the internet. You know, they didn't even have cell phones. Forget about smartphones. I know the kids are going, huh? There was nothing like that. There was no social media. There wasn't anything like that. This was back in a time when that kind of was our social media. That's when we were being influencers through our speech, through our words, the way we talked and related to one another. That was it. Now, we look at these kinds of things and we have to start to ask ourselves, like, now I know that none of you here have ever had to deal with this and have probably never done it, but there's this word that we all have to embrace and admit it that it does exist. And I know it's hard for you to accept this because you've never heard about it, but it's called gossip. Gossip. It's one of those things that's what we were doing back then. And gossip is one of those things where we use the power of our words to hurt another. We use the power of our words, true or not, because of someone that we want to damage, someone that we want to control, someone that we want to, and you fill in the blank as to why you might be doing it. Well, you wouldn't be doing it. I'm just using that as an expression. But we do that from time to time. People, I mean, this is not something new. We were doing it back then. But think about today. Think about what we see today. We swim in a culture where calumny is okay, where detraction is okay. This kind of gossip thing is very public. You know, like we were a small group just sitting in the corner of a cafeteria, but think about social media today. I mean, half of what I see on social media fits into gossip, of people just talking about somebody else and trying to poison you against this person that you've probably never met. Or even just the regular mainstream media, the way we talk about others. And I just find it to be very distasteful, number one. And number two, I find it something that has to be addressed. Jesus, if you want to make the comparison, Jesus of his time was a social influencer. He did it by the methods that they did then. Now, back then, of course, they weren't going to get on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or anything like that because it didn't exist. I know it's hard for the little ones to believe, but those things didn't exist. The way you did it back then was you became a teacher, a rabbi. And as a rabbi, then you tried to collect people to be around you that you can share your message with, who share the message, and then it goes out and they bring others to be friends with you. And Jesus obviously was quite successful because in a short period of time, he had 1,000 followers, 10,000 followers, whatever it was, giving talks to thousands at a time. That, of course, is going to get the attention of other influencers. You know, the other influencers, the Pharisees and the scribes. And Jesus is going to have choice words for them in 2 weeks. He's going to speak his mind. We'll talk a little bit more about it then. But think about this. This is what he, in effect, if you want to make parallels to today, yet what Jesus is doing was very different than the other influencers of his time. Jesus was a good Jew, but he was anything but ordinary. He wasn't playing the game the way they played it. He wasn't using his influence the way they did. And you can even hear it in expressions in the Gospels when someone will say, he doesn't speak like the rest of them. He speaks with an authority. He speaks with this convincing power. There was something about him. Jesus was anything but ordinary. Now, the ordinary crew, the scribes, the Pharisees, the other rabbis, they set the tone, and they told people what to think and what to believe. And let's face it, when it comes to being an influencer, repeating the same thing over and over and over again will eventually get people to think it's true. And so there was a lot of repetition, and they just kept rehashing the same things over and over again. Now, take what happened in today's gospel. This is a classic example, in my opinion. And one of the things that I did when I started to prepare this series, Anything But Ordinary, think of the crowd. Very rarely do we spend much time thinking about the crowd. We hear about Jesus, we hear about, Bartimaeus, but think about the crowd. There's really only that one sentence that says, and they tried to prevent him from going to Jesus. Hush up, you. Stop. You're a blind man. You're a beggar. Don't bother the teacher. Now, by this point in the gospel, Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. He's already set the tone of what his ministry is going to be. He's made it clear. He's gone up and touched lepers. He's talked to those who are outcasts, the beggars. He even went up to tax collectors and talked to them, which was verboten in the social media realm of his time. They're the outcasts. They're the ones who are cast out for a reason. And nobody should be dealing with them. Nobody should be talking to them. Leave them. Like a blind man or someone who has a physical malady, their social influence was they sinned in some way. They offended God. That's why they're afflicted. And everybody started to believe it. So what does the crowd do? Well, this is what I've always believed. This poor blind man is a beggar. He's there because he's a sinner. He's an outcast by God. Therefore, nobody should be dealing with this guy. Stay away. And that's the kind of thing that gossip can do. That's the kind of thing that detraction does. And I just find it one of those things that I wish I could say that it doesn't exist anymore, and yet it exists at an nth degree today because everybody wants to be an influencer. Now, I want you to just spend a few moments with this because Jesus is anything but ordinary. He is trying to set a tone. He's trying to tell them, no, I've come to preach the original message. The one you forgot? The one that you forgot because of all this gossip and detraction and calumny that you're spreading everywhere? I've come to get you back. And we're going to find out about that next week. He's going to be very clear when he's asked, what is the greatest commandment? And I know every one of you sitting here can recite the greatest commandment. So we'll save that one for next week. But he's here to try to remind them that human beings are persons that should get respect and dignity no matter who they are, no matter what their situation. He's here for the human person, not for the problem. Think about that again. He's here to help the human person. He's here to heal a person, not a problem. See, so often we see, and this is what happens in the gossip, we turn someone into an object so that we can use our language to ostracize them, to scare others away from them. But every human being that exists is still a human person that should demand respect and dignity. And if we Christians who are followers of Jesus Christ, if we're following Jesus Christ, we've got to get his message down. He's saying we've got to stop demonizing others and loving them. We've got to start loving them. So think of the person right now that you dislike the most. I mean, most of our politicians probably fall into that case, but Think of the person that you dislike the most. Can you love that person? Can you let yourself love that person? See the person and not the problem? They're human beings that have been demonized through the gossip of the mainstream media, or through social media, or through the opinions of others. But they're still human persons. This is a hard thing for us because we're Catholics. We follow Jesus Christ, and Jesus is asking us, he's imploring us to be anything but ordinary. And if we're being just like everybody else in our society, if we're being just like everybody else and espousing the same techniques and the same words that everybody else is espousing, there's something seriously wrong in our Christianity. Gossip is a mortal sin. We're going to hear about it in the Catechism in a year, in a few days. It's something that we ought to avoid at all costs. Now, there's nothing wrong with our talking with one another and trying to help one another, but there is a problem when we're using our words to damage or hurt others. Think about the words you use to describe people in your life. Forget about famous people, forget about politicians. Think about sometimes the words you use, someone that you know personally, someone you work with, someone in your family, maybe even your own spouse when you get together with someone else. And the words that you're choosing, the words that you're using about them. Are they intended to hurt and damage their reputation, to damage their image? Or are you using words that reflect the human person that you're supposed to be loving? This is going to be a real challenge for us. Like this week, I want us to all examine our language a little bit. Look at the way that we're doing things. Are we ordinary or anything but ordinary? There's a great litany that I started praying years ago, and I really needed it, and it's called the Litany of Humility. You can look it up, it's very easy to find. And I started praying that every day because I have to remind myself that I'm a nobody. And the Litany of Humility helps me remember that. I'm a nobody. I might have a small little world of influence somewhere, and if I'm using it for the greater glory of God, okay, but in the end, I'm a nobody. 2 or 3 or 4 generations from now, nobody will know who I was, and I'm okay with that. Humility, to be that humble person that does what's right to do because it's right to do. To just go and live in this society and contribute because it's right to do. Not to become famous, not to become rich, not to become any of those things. If they happen, okay, but I still have to wake up and be a humble servant of God. And to be a humble servant of God means that I've got to live the great commandment. It means that I have to live that in relation to even those people I don't like. That's where it gets hard, doesn't it? But Jesus uses those words. He doesn't say, love the people that love you and the people you like. He actually comes out and says, love your enemies. So let's try to do that. Let's do it by examining our words, the speech that we use every day. Are we damaging or are we building up the kingdom? Are we trying to attack or are we trying to console? Are we looking to hurt or are we looking to heal? I know myself, I like to heal and I like to help others heal. And the only way that's going to happen is by breaking down that barrier where I look at the other person as an object or a problem to be fixed and not a person to be loved. And so every human being that you see this week, say those words, human person to be loved. Every person that you look at, like even that person that cut you off in traffic, human person to be loved. And then ask, how is that possible or how is that going to be done? How am I going to make the adaptations I need to make in the way I treat others? Today we're called to be anything but ordinary and to be a lot like Jesus. So let's strive to be anything but ordinary. God bless you.